Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and greetings to everyone. As for today's lecture, we're going to take a look at the topics of the autonomic nervous system. So before we go deep further in the autonomic nervous system topic, so let's move to the learning outcomes of this chapter first. So the first one, at the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe the anatomicals and also the functional specializations of the autonomic nervous system, so which include the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So basically, sympathetic and parasympathetic is actually under the roof of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so the second one, you should be able to explain or describe the importance of the sympathetic and also the parasympathetic tone. Okay, so for the third one, you should be able to explain the effect of the sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulations of various organs. So it means that when the sympathetic or the parasympathetic stimulation is activated, or it's being being stimulated to a certain various organ, what is the effect of this sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulations towards that organ? Okay, so the number 4, you should be able to explain the features, okay, and also the mechanisms, and as well as the importance of the fight and flight, by which the fight and flight are actually under the sympathetic stimulation, and rest and digest response are actually under the parasympathetic response. Okay, so let's move on to number 5. So when it comes to number 5, when you already understand the whole the anatomical structures, the functional characteristics and whatnot, so when you do know the basic or the normal physiology of the system, then when it comes to the clinical disturbances, so you should be able to differentiate, or this is under the disturbance of sympathetic or parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, and then last but not least, once you have gone through the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, you should be able to differentiate between these two autonomic nervous system. Okay, so before we go deep detail, let's understand first the umbrella of the nervous system mapping. Okay, before you go further to the sympathetic, parasympathetic and whatnot, let's take a look what is actually the nervous system is. So where does this parasympathetic and sympathetic, or we classify it as the autonomic nervous system, take place? Okay, so let's move on to the left bottom corner of my slide over here. As you can see, that in our body system, we are actually working like a computer system. By which, why did I say that we are actually working as a computer system? Because in the computer itself, you do know that we have a keyboard, you have a mouse, by which it's actually acting like an input toward the CPU, okay, towards the central core of the computer. But then the CPU is actually acting like a brain, okay, by which it's going to stimulate whatever inputs that you give to it. Okay, it's going to analyze whatever input or whatever order that you give to it. And then once the CPU already analyzed and whatever it is, then later it's going to give an output. For example, like a printer. So the printer is actually like the output from the processing from the central nervous system, which is the brain itself. Okay. So when we talk about the nervous system mapping, it's just the same with the computer system. Okay, ni kita bagi simulation yang mudah untuk all of you to understand. Alright. So now let's get back to this bottom left corner. So in our body system, in a human system, not only human, in the living system, okay, an organism, we do have a receptor system. So in receptor system, like your fingers, your skin, what else? Your peripheral organ and whatnot. Okay, so at your receptors, you have a visceral sensory receptors, as well as you have you have a somatic sensory receptor as well as the visceral sensory receptors. So what is the difference between the somatic sensory receptor as well as the visceral sensory receptor? The first one, when you talk about the somatic sensory receptor, is actually going to tell you or going to collect the informations from the external environment. For example, like your fingertips, your skin, okay, your body, your external environment, okay, from your external environment. So it is classified as a somatic sensory receptors. So it's not only the fingers, the skin and whatnot can detect the changes in the environment. So your organ, your internal organ as well, can detect the changes in your internal environment. Okay, so that internal environment, the sensors or the receptors are, we call it as the visceral sensory receptors. Okay, so from the whatever information that collect from the internal organ, from the visceral organ, so we call it as the visceral sensory receptors. So all of these belong to the category of the receptor, which is the input. Okay, so then later when the information has been gathered, okay, we key in the information. So all of this information will be delivered to the central processing unit, which is our central nervous system. Okay, before the informations from the receptors has gone through the central nervous system, it must pass a cable or a channel by which this channel are actually located at the peripheral nervous system. And the channel or the input channel, we call it as the afferent division. Okay, afferent division. Right? So all of these informations from the external environment, from the internal environment will be delivered to the central nervous system to be processed. Alright? So as far as concerned, in our central nervous system, it consists of the brain and also the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord regions will process all of the informations, either to decide whether this information is going to be to enhance the effect or to reduce the effects. It's all belong to the central nervous system in the information processing unit, which is the brain and also the spinal cord. And later, once all of the information has been decided what to do with it, all of these informations will be delivered to the output system. Okay, and the cable for our output system, we call it as the efferent division. Okay, so it's quite different and special for the efferent division, because in the efferent division, here it goes, it has a somatic nervous system and it also has the autonomic nervous system. So when I ask you a question there, when does your or where is your autonomic nervous system located? So the answer must be at the efferent divisions of the nervous system. Okay, so means that when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, when you look at the chapter for our lecture today, we say that autonomic nervous system, sympathetic paranervous system. So in our central nervous system, where it is located? Okay, again, it is located at the efferent divisions of the central nervous, of the nervous system. Okay, so before we go further, let's take both of it. Okay, we take a look at the somatic nervous system, we take a look at the autonomic nervous system. So why? Because before you go further to the autonomic nervous system, you should have known what is the opponent of the autonomic nervous system is the somatic nervous system. So that easy for you to go through with it, to classify it, to differentiate it, and so forth. Okay, so let's take a look at the somatic nervous system first. In the somatic nervous system, when you talk about the somatic, it's basically the information will be given to the organs that you can control, so that you can voluntarily control. For example, like in our body system, we can control our skeletal muscles. So the muscles that we can't control is actually the smooth muscles. But once it comes to the skeletal muscles, so means that you can control, it's belong under the somatic nervous system. Alright, means that the things that out of my control, for example, like the digestive system, digestions and whatnot, my blood circulations, okay, so all of these I can't control myself, so it will occur automatically. Therefore, all of these informations are actually will fall under the autonomic nervous system. Okay, you ready? Alright, so now let's go further on the autonomic nervous system. Okay, under the umbrella of the autonomic nervous system, we have two components, which is sympathetic nervous system as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, alright, so right now let's take a look at the just overall structures of the autonomic nervous system first. Okay, so when we say that the somatic nervous system goes to the skeletal muscles, so where does this autonomic nervous system goes? So it will goes to the smooth other than skeletal muscle, okay, which includes the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles. Okay, can you control your heartbeat? No, you can't control. So means that it is under the autonomic system. It's automatically controlled. So yeah, so autonomic ni automatic lah. Okay, and then the gland as well as the adipose tissue. Okay, so now before we go further again, let's recap on the somatic nervous system as well as the autonomic nervous system. So in the general view, Somatic and autonomic are actually under the efferent division of the nervous system. Okay, what makes the somatic nervous system as well as the autonomic nervous system different is that the somatic is under the voluntary control, but the autonomic is the automatic control by which involuntarily control. Okay, for the somatic, it is a skeletal muscles, and the autonomic other than the skeletal muscle. Okay, so now let's take a look at the somatic nervous system. It includes both, which is the sensory neuron as well as the motor neuron. Okay, if you don't understand with this term, let's take a look at this. In the somatic nervous system, it includes from the input, okay, from the somatic sensory receptor down to the output. But for the autonomic, from the visceral sensory receptors down to the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so for somatic nervous system, it includes both the sensory neuron, which is convey the input from the receptors, and for the motor neuron, which is innervate the skeletal muscles. And one more thing, if you can take a look at these notes. So basically, for the somatic nervous system, it will release a neurotransmitter which is known as the acetylcholine. Okay, ACH in the short term for it lah. Okay, so then what is autonomic nervous system? So autonomic nervous system, when it comes to its name, auto means self, nomos means control. So means that the autonomic nervous system is actually the system that is automatically controlled. So the response of the body to the environment without conscious controls of the environment. So for example, like if let's say you went to a very cold place, for example, like you went to the Antarctic, okay? So you went to the Antarctic, the environment is very cold, and then you start to have a goosebump. Okay, so did you control your goosebump? No, you don't. So it means that your body system are actually give a response to the environment without your conscious control. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system is actually part of the peripheral nervous system, but somehow it controls and regulates your internal organ. Okay, without your conscious control lah. Alright. So for example, like we have the changes in the size of the blood vessels, right? Your heartbeat, your size of the pupils. So you don't control, but it is actually the autonomic response. So it's exert control on involuntary organ. So what are the involuntary organ? Anything like endocrine or endocrine gland. Are you able to control the secretions of your hormone? So endocrine gland is actually a gland that secretes your hormone. Are you able to control the secretions of your hormone every month? No, you don't know. You don't. Alright, so your blood vessels, are you able to control the dilations, the constrictions of your blood vessels to ensure the efficiency in the blood circulations? No, you don't. Alright, as well as the circulation, your excretion of your saliva, for example. Did you control your secretions of saliva? For example, like this fasting season, for example, I did bring the pizza early in the morning, and then or in the evening, like you're going to have a fasting later, right? To have an iftar later. You smell that pizza, so you will have the excretion, salivary excretion. Did you control the salivary excretion? No, you don't. Alright, respirations and whatnot. From here, all of these examples. Okay, you don't control. Okay, so basically, so what does this autonomic nervous system do? Right? So basically, in our body system, in a chapter 1, for example, in a course 1, for example, that you did learn about the homeostasis process. So meaning homeostasis process is actually the autonomic control of our body system by which it's going to maintain to its optimum level. Similarly to our autonomic nervous system. So what in your body help you to maintain your homeostasis is basically the autonomic control. The autonomic nervous system itself is going to contribute to the homeostasis. For example, like if let's say you going for a jogging, for example, and you sweating a lot, but then your body start to dehydrating, for example, so you start to feeling thirst. Who give you the sense of feeling thirst? It's actually the autonomic nervous system. But somehow, okay, these visual sensations and whatnot are actually either exciting or inhibiting. So it means that either it enhances you to drink water, it inhibits you from drinking water. Okay. Alright, so now let's take a look at the differences between the somatic and autonomic first. Okay, before we go under the roof of the autonomic, you should have noticed differences between the somatic and also autonomic. Okay, so from here, if you take a look at the reflex arch, this criteria, we have a reflex arch, receptors, efferent pathway, and effector organ. So all of these components are actually called as the reflex arch. So means that in our body system, inside our nervous system mapping just now, so we should have receptors, okay, as the input. We should have afferent pathway, okay. You should have the efferent neuron, as well as what is the effector organs to bring out the output of the sensation, okay. So all of these known as the reflex arch. In the somatic nervous system, okay, this reflex arch going to collect the information from the external environment. But somehow, for the autonomic nervous system, it's going to collect the information from the visceral organ. Okay, so means that from your internal environment. Okay, for its receptors, is going to be detected from the body surface. Alright, and this one from the visceral structures. For the afferent pathway, means that the input cable, so it's going to enter the spinal cord via dorsal root. Its cell body in the dorsal root of ganglion, and its terminate in the dorsal horn or motor neurons in the ventral horn. But somehow, the mapping or the locations of the cell body and the inputs of the afferent pathway, the cable going to be plugged to a different plug point. Okay, so maksud dia kat sini lah. So means that if you are in the somatic nervous system, its neuron are going to be, its cable going to be plugged at different portion of the spinal cord. For the autonomic, it will be plugged at another portions of the autonomic of the spinal cord. Okay, maksudnya dia tak akan pergi kat plug point yang sama lah, sebab kalau awak tengok kabel sistem pun, kabel sistem kat belakang CPU pun, dia punya point insert dia kat tempat port untuk mic lain, port untuk untuk speaker lain, okay, port untuk USB lain. So that's what does it mean by the afferent pathway or afferent input for the somatic and also autonomic. Right? So let's move on to the autonomic. It's going to enter the spinal cord via dorsal root, or similarly, it enters the spinal cord via dorsal root. Alright, the channel is just the same, but somehow it terminates in the autonomic afferent neurons. But terminate on the autonomic afferent neurons with its cell body is basically located at the intermediolateral horn of the spinal cord, ILH. Alright, so this one for the somatic, its cell body is located at the dorsal root of ganglion, but for the autonomic, its cell body is actually located at the intermediolateral horn of the spinal cord. So we're going to take a look at this mapping later, okay? For the efferent neuron, its motor neuron originate from the ventral horn, okay? Its motor neuron, its output originate from the ventral horn, okay? But it directly terminate on the effector organ, which is a skeletal muscles, means that the organ that you can control voluntarily just now. But for the autonomic nervous system, it actually has two effector neuron, means that the output cable, there are two output cables from the autonomic nervous system. So the first output cable, we call it as the first order neuron, which is also known as the preganglionic neuron. Alright, and the second one is the second order neuron, means that the second cable that connect to the first cable just now, known as the second order neuron, or also known as the postganglionic neuron. Alright, so the cell body for the first order neuron is located at the intermediolateral horn, okay, this one, okay, at the afferent point just now in the spinal cord. But for the second order neuron, its cell body is actually located outside the spinal cord, and sometimes it can be in the effector organ itself. Okay. Alright, so the effector one is going to innervate the smooth muscle and also the other involuntary organ system. Okay, so this is the structural differences of the somatic and also the autonomic nervous system. If we take a look at this structure, for example, you can see that we have a skeletal muscle which gives, from the brain, it can give an input by which it goes directly to the skeletal muscles. This is a somatic nervous system by which the output, okay, the output cable is only one output cable connected to the skeletal muscle. Okay, but for the autonomic nervous system, you can see that we have two output cable. Okay, the red one we call it as the first order neuron. Okay, yang ini tadi saya cakap tadi, first order neuron, by which its cell body is located in the ILH. So this is the spinal cord. We just imagine that this is a spinal cord. I will show you later where is the ILH, the intramedullary horn. Okay, so the first order neuron or the preganglionic neuron will give an input to the second order neuron or the postganglionic neuron, by which the cell body of the second order neuron are actually located at the RNR, which this RNR known as the ganglia. Okay, so the first order neuron will communicate with the second order neuron, and where does they communicate? They communicate in a RNR or a station or a relay station, which is known as the autonomic ganglia. Okay, kita panggil dia ganglia ataupun autonomic ganglia. Okay, habis tu cell body yang first order kat mana? In the spinal cord. Alright, so here is a clear examples where does this the plot or the connection point mapping for the somatic as well as the autonomic system. So for the somatic, you can take a look at this one. This is a cell body of the somatic motor neuron, which is located at the dorsal root ventral horn. Okay, but for the autonomic, it's located at the intermedial horn. So inter means inside the grey matter, medial means in the middle, lateral means at the side, horn is at this portion. Okay, so we call it as the intermedial horn of the spinal cord. Okay, let's go into relate informations. And this bulb, if you take a look at the large structure that connect from one point up here down to this point and the third one and the fourth one. So this is actually the relay station, by which the relay stations means that the stations that the first order neuron and the second order neurons are connected to each other, are talking or communicate with each other, and this station we call as the autonomic ganglia. Okay, so in autonomic nervous system, comparing to the somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system consists of the ganglia, and they have two efferent neuron, which is the first order neuron or preganglionic neuron, and the second order neuron or the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so if you take a look at the books, for example, a reference books or during anatomy class, okay, if you take a look at the samples or the specimens of the spinal cord, okay, this is the spinal cord, you might see that they are actually like a change that is located beside the spinal cord. Dia macam ni, dia ada satu chain yang beside the spinal cord. This is actually the ganglia. So we call it as the sympathetic ganglia. Right? Sympathetic change, because it's come in chain. We call it as a sympathetic change of ganglia. Chain rantaian. Okay. So now, let's take a look at the comparisons of the somatic and also autonomic reflex. So this is somatic because I did mention to you at the efferent output of the somatic there are only one neuron, but for the autonomic we have two, the pre and post, or the first order or the second order, by which it's communicate in the ganglia. Okay. Alright, so here is another example. If you can take a look at the somatic efferent pathway, they have the axon by which their axon are actually end with a synaptic terminal. Okay, so this is a synaptic terminal. They have a barb, by which basically for the somatic efferent pathway, its terminals is look like this. But for the autonomic efferent pathway, basically their terminals are basically present in the form of varicosity. Okay, so we call it as the varicosity. You can see that macam ada barb that connected to each other, then and it is spread to a regions of a target organ. Okay, so we call it as the varicosity. So basically, all motor neuron will release acetylcholine. I did mention to you just now. So for the neurons that innervate the skeletal muscles, basically they will release a neurotransmitter which is known as the acetylcholine. But for the autonomic, all preganglionic, this is a preganglionic neurons, so all preganglionic neuron going to release acetylcholine, but postganglionic sympathetic neuron are going to release the norepinephrine or acetylcholine. But for postganglionic parasympathetic, it's going to secrete the acetylcholine. Okay, we're going to take a look at this component later. Alright, so here is another examples that we can take a look on the mapping or in the structures of the this diagram just to show you a summary or a simple structures to make you better understand the differences between the autonomic and also somatic. So now just take a look at the autonomic. We don't differentiate between the sympathetic and parasympathetic first. Just take a look at as the overall. So you can take a look at the autonomic nervous system. There are 2 neurons. Okay, 1, 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. But sometimes for the autonomic nervous system, sometimes they don't have the second order neuron because all of the informations are directly being released by the ganglia, okay, straight away to the effector organ. Okay, we're going to take a look at it later. Okay, so now let's move on to the chapter of the autonomic nervous system in specific. Okay, so for autonomic nervous system, we are actually being designed to have two to use this autonomic nervous system in 2 important situations. So the first situation is either fight or flight, either you sparing or you run, okay, fight or flight, or no emergency response, for example like rest and digest, like resting or digesting. Okay, so this autonomic nervous system going to control these 2 important situations, either you fight or flight or you rest and digest. I did mention to you so many times that this autonomic nervous system function for the homeostatic process, for the visceral to regulate the activity of the visceral organ, okay, and then to smoothing your body response to the environmental changes. For example, like if let's say you're walking at the garden and suddenly you're being chased by the dog, okay, so are you going to prepare that you can run when you're being chased by the dog? Okay, you are automatically going to run when you're being chased. So why? Because it is under the autonomic response. That one example. Another example is that let's say that you are going to have an exam, for example, that morning, and then you decided to take nasi lemak. Okay, you eat nasi lemak and then you go to the exam hall. Alright, during the exam, did you decide to digest your food or you decide to answer the questions? Because you are having anxiety at the moment. So you can't decide. You can't decide to do both. So the things that you can't decide to do, let your body decide it to do for you, for the homeostatic system. So your stomach going to digest whatever food you have. And if let's say at the same time, that the process is the rest and digest process. But if let's say at the same time you have the anxiety, so the sympathetic nervous system going to take place. Okay. As well as the coordinations of the body response during exercise. For example, like you're having a jogging, for example, and then when you have a jogging, and then your body start to produce sweat, or your body not first they're not producing sweat, but they're producing heat. You are jogging. Are you can you at the moment like decided that, oh, I'm going to have a sweating at the moment, so I need to control my sweating process? No, you will not decide. So your body going to decide. So your body temperature is increased. So it's automatically going to undergo sweating, so that to reduce the body temperature. So that is the examples of the response to exercise and as well as the stress. Okay, and then the last part is the assisting to the endocrine systems and regulates your reproductive functions, like especially this one for the female. Okay, so who are controlling your autonomic nervous system? So basically it is under the control of the central processing unit, which is the higher center, which is the brain and as well as the spinal cord. Okay, so what are they? Where are they? Where it is located? So it is actually located at the hypothalamus, right? And then they play a major controls and integrations of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the output from the hypothalamus will influence whatever the autonomic center has decided. Okay, so for example, like in the CPS, salivation, swallowing, vomiting, okay, and the spinal cord going to decide for the defecations and also urination. Okay. Alright, so basically, the posterior and lateral part of the hypothalamus going to control the sympathetic division, and the anterior and also the middle part of the hypothalamus going to control the parasympathetic division. Okay. Alright, so come again in the autonomic component of the reflex arch. Okay, I did mention to you when we said that, oh, reflex arch. So what is actually under reflex reflex arch. So under reflex arch, there are receptors. Again, the receptors, the input, the sensory neuron, okay, the efferent and efferent neuron, and then we have the integration center. Sensory neuron is efferent neuron. Okay, either both lah. Kalau you jawab sensory neuron or jawab efferent neuron, so both are correct. So integrating center, which is the central processing unit, your brain as well as the spinal cord, and then you have a motor neuron. Okay, the effector neuron, and also the effector means the organ itself, the effector organ itself. Okay, so now under the autonomic nervous systems, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, let's discuss on the similarities of these two components first. The similarities between the sympathetic and also the parasympathetic nervous system. So both the sympathetic or parasympathetic or both the autonomic nervous system, they are efferent motor system. I did mention to you. So in the nervous system mapping, where does this autonomic nervous system located? So it is actually located at the efferent motor system. Dekat output dia autonomic output. So efferent motor system. Okay. Both are involved in the homeostasis or regulations of the internal environment out of your control. Okay. And they are both sympathetic or parasympathetic. Under the autonomic nervous system, they consist of two neurons, which is the pre and post, or sometimes you call it as the first order neuron or the second order neuron, by which these two neurons going to communicate or relay or synapse at the region which is known as the ganglia. And later, it's innervate to the unconscious control or visceral target organ. Okay. So here is the example that we have a spinal cord. We have the cell body of the first order neuron, okay, and we have the preganglionic neuron by which they're going to communicate with the second order neuron at the autonomic ganglion. So means that the cell body of the second order neuron located at the autonomic ganglia, and then they have a second order neuron or the post ganglionic neuron, okay, and then this post ganglionic neuron going to innervate the effector organ. Okay, so now let's move on to the differences in the divisions of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. In the situation, sympathetic going to control the fight or flight response, and parasympathetic going to control the rest and digest. Okay. So functional specialization for sympathetic is going to regulate your blood pressure, your respiration, your metabolism, and for parasympathetic, it's majorly focused on the gastric motility, digestions, and energy restoration. So whatever the anabolism process, okay, means that the restore of the energy process, it's belong to parasympathetic. When we come to the catabolism process, by which the breakdown or break out the energy to do something, it's belong to the sympathetic nervous system. So the cell body, okay, now we're talking about the cell body of the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic are basically located at the thoracic and lumbar region. If you take a look at this structure, okay, now it's changing. The sympathetic will be in the right side and the parasympathetic on the left side. Just take a look at the sympathetic division. In the sympathetic division, if you take a look at this one, the cell body of the preganglionic neuron, its cell body are actually coming from the thoracic region and also the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Okay, again, the sympathetic division, they have the preganglionic neuron having the cell body that is originated from the thoracic and also lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Therefore, we classify it as the thoracolumbar divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Meanwhile, for the parasympathetic, the cell body of the preganglionic neuron are basically originated from the cranial regions as well as the sacral regions. That's why we call it as the craniosacral divisions of the spinal cord. Okay. So now let's move on to the length of the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. It's also quite different. Alright. So both of it, they have the pre and post order neuron. Preganglionic neuron as well as postganglionic neuron. Similarly to the parasympathetic, they have pre and they have post order neuron. Means that they have two neurons. But what make difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic is specifically the length of the pre and post neuron. Okay, so basically if you take a look at this one, you can see that which one is longer, which one is shorter. So the pre one is shorter and the post neuron is the longer one in the sympathetic nervous system. But somehow, for the parasympathetic, it's in the opposite manners. Alright? So in the parasympathetic, you can see that the pre or the neuron is basically longer comparing to the post or the neuron. Okay? Okay, so sometimes if you take a look at that, we have adrenal medulla. So adrenal medulla itself, for example, like this one, they are actually one of the ganglia. Okay, so I did mention to you just now, if you take a look at the spinal cord specimen, for example, so you will have spinal cord, and beside the spinal cord, you will see one change that connected to the spinal cord. This one we call it as the sympathetic change of ganglia. Okay, but not all of the ganglia of the sympathetic divisions are in this chain. Okay, sometimes its ganglia can out of track, so out of the location. For example, if you take a look at the celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, okay, so these ganglion are actually outside of the sympathetic change ganglia. Alright, sometimes they are located near to the effector organ. This one located really near to the spinal cord. But for the ganglion of the parasympathetic division, basically is located near the effector organ. Okay, like this one. Alright, ciliary ganglion is really near to the eyes and so forth. Okay, so I did mention this one already to you. You can read this by yourself. It's just for your information. Okay, so we have the input, we have a processing system, we have the output by which all the preganglionic will release acetylcholine, and you have the postganglionic by which in sympathetic, it's post or the neuron going to secrete norepinephrine, epinephrine, and in adrenal medulla, it's going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Sorry. And then in sweat gland, it's going to secrete the acetylcholine. But for the postganglionic, coming from the craniosacral region, it's going to secrete the acetylcholine. So what are the control that being under the regulations of the autonomic nervous system? Is at the contractions or relaxations of the smooth muscles, either to increase or decrease rates and force of cardiac muscle contractions, or increase and decrease gland secretion. So either they decide to increase or decrease, it depends on its integrating center. But sometimes in our body systems, so our organ, sometimes or not sometimes, most of the organ systems inside our body, they have dual innervation. I'm sorry because I have my tonsil are swollen, really hard for me to talk. Okay, sorry for my accent. So most of the organ, they have dual innervation. So what does that mean by dual innervation? Is that some of the organ, for example like the heart, they can receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic cable to it. Okay, bahasa senang dia cable lah. So the heart, for example, dia dapat dua-dua. Dia dapat parasympathetic cable, dia dapat sympathetic cables. But the location is depending on the locations of the heart lah. Okay. So now when we're looking on the somatic nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system by which its effector neuron release acetylcholine. But for the autonomic nervous system, on parasympathetic, they will release acetylcholine both on the pre and post. But for sympathetic, they're going to release the acetylcholine at the pre, and at their post, they're going to secrete the norepinephrine. But for adrenal medulla, they don't have a second order neuron because they are actually going to secrete the adrenal medulla actually acting like a ganglia. Okay, so it's quite special. Adrenal medulla is actually the ganglia itself, by which once the first order neuron innervate the adrenal medulla will start releasing the hormone straight away into the bloodstream, and they don't have a second order neuron, by which the neurotransmitter that been released by the adrenal medulla, for example, like we have the norepinephrine and epinephrine, all of it going to be secreted into the bloodstream, directly go to the effector organ. Okay. So In the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity, or we call it as the Autonomic Division, it could have dual innervation, so means that one organ going to be received two cable, which is sympathetic and parasympathetic, or sometimes they might have the opposing effect, so means that sympathetic is enhancing, parasympathetic is decreasing the effect, or sometimes it could have the synergistic effect, so means like controlling up and down between each other. Sometimes they might work independently, sometimes they might work together. Okay, so we call it as the reciprocal. Okay, so here is the examples of the dual innervations of the heart. So we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic. I did mention that both of it innervates the heart. So sympathetic, they have short pre and long post, by which both of the pre going to release the acetylcholine. Okay, nic ni apa? Nicotinic receptors lah. Inside the bracket means that the receptors of the second of the neuron. So this acetylcholine neurotransmitter going to act on the nicotinic receptors on the sympathetic, and later it going to release the norepinephrine, and this norepinephrine or adrenaline or adrenergic on the adrenergic receptors. When these adrenergic receptors being activated, it will increase the heart rate. But if let's say that the parasympathetic activity has been activated, it's going to release the acetylcholine, and this acetylcholine going to act on the muscarinic receptors. Okay, so this muscarinic receptor, this second of the neuron going to release the acetylcholine, going to act on muscarinic receptor as well, and it will reduce the rate of the heart. Okay, so reduce the heartbeat lah. Okay, in the physiological effect of the autonomic nervous system, we have the autonomic tone. So what does that mean by the autonomic tone? Okay, so as noted earlier, most of our body system will receive innervations from both autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, but somehow these parasympathetic and sympathetic work in the opposite manners, by which the sympathetic going to increase and parasympathetic going to decrease its effect. Okay, so why does they acting so? That is because they're going to balance between the two. So when they balance between the two, we call it as the autonomic tone. So who controls this autonomic tone? I did mention to you that the autonomic nervous system is actually under the regulations of the hypothalamus. Okay, but we also have a few structures in our body that receive only sympathetic innervation. So what are they? They are sweat gland. Okay, so there are erector pili muscles, right? The things that control your hair follicles, okay, your goosebumps and whatnot. You have a kidney, spleen, blood vessels, and also the adrenal medulla. So all of these organs are basically only receive a single innervations from the sympathetic innervations. Okay, so means that no opposition from the parasympathetic. No, they will not get any information from the parasympathetic activation. But then, how can they control? So they just control the current that come to it, either you on or off. So dia tak ada synergistic lah, dia tak ada reciprocal lah, dia tak ada yang sekarang sympathetic yang activate, kejap lagi parasympathetic pula activate untuk release, untuk reducekan sympathetic tadi. So they would not acting like that. But the one that receive a single innervation, especially for sympathetic innervations, they themselves going to cut off the current that come to it. Okay, the information that come to it. Okay, so here is the example that dual innervations of the organ. For example, that you have the eyes, okay, the pupils especially. You have the salivary glands, the heart, the bronchioles, the lung, respiratory systems. You have a stomach, okay. You have a liver. You have the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla is only the sympathetic system, okay. And then you have the bladder, urinary bladder. You will also have a reproductive system. Okay, then with that, now let's move on the short and long reflex. So when it comes to short and long, so you did understand short and long. So when it's add another terms to short and long, they add a terms reflex. So means that the reflex that is short or instant, or the reflex that is going to take a long time. So what's the difference between these two? Right, The short reflex means the reflex that will not pass to the spinal cord. Okay, they will straight away go to the ganglion synapse with the information. Okay, the information from the receptors will directly synapse with the second order neuron in the ganglion, right? Second order neuron in the ganglion, and later all of the informations will be delivered to the system, to the effector organ. But for the long reflex, first, whatever it is, they should come the receptors informations, the sensory informations to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord, it will go to the normal root of the autonomic system. Okay, so here is the differences and similarity that you can see and you can read by yourself. Here is just an additional images or additional diagram for you to refer to lah. Alright, so now let's move on to the sympathetic nervous system in focus. So look at this picture. So basically the lion will attack the herd of the buffalo. But now when there are herds of buffalo, the lions will run away. Will get nervous and run away. So what does this sympathetic system do? So this sympathetic nervous system are actually going to control the number of functions in our body. For example, the regulations of our blood pressure, respiration, as well as the metabolism. So basically, the sympathetic system are actually the systems that need to support our emergency needs or emergency situation lah, or stressful situation. So we call this sympathetic response as E state, which is the excitement state, emergency state, embracement state. So all of this state is going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So when I put S and S is sympathetic nervous system. When I put SP and S, it is parasympathetic nervous system. So when does the sympathetic response take place? For example, like during physical activity or emotional stress, you start to have anxiety. So that is actually a sign of a fight and flight response. Okay. So physical activity, of course, or rapid productions of the ATP means that during catabolism process, or means that during the sympathetic system, your body start to break down all of the energy resources that you have because you're going to fight or you're going to fly. Okay. Okay, now let's take a look at the activation of sympathetic divisions and release hormone. For example, like in the adrenal medulla, so it will release the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what they will do, they will dilate the pupils, okay, so that you will have far vision. Alright, so the dilations of the pupils means that your diameter of the pupils is going to be increased. Why is that so? Because to increase the length of vision. So it means that you will have the far vision during the fight and flight response. Okay, and then going to increase your heart rate. Because why? Because to increase your oxygen consumption, because your body during the stressful situation, your body are actually producing or will produce a lot of energy, will use a lot of energy. So in order for your cell body to produce a lot of energy, they need oxygen to break down all of the resources that they keep before. Right? So that's why your heart rate going to increase, your respiratory rate start to increase during this situation. Right? So constrictions of the blood vessels. Right? Why during the excitement state your blood vessel going to constrict? Because it going to increase the delivery time. Okay, so the delivery time decrease lah, terbalik lah, maksudnya dia nak cepatkan proses blood circulations to supply kidney as well as the constrict the blood vessels that supply the kidney and as well as the gastrointestinal tract, means that the blood will be reduced at this portion and also at the peripheral organ, but it will focus more on the central system, core. See here, you can see that the dilations of the blood vessels will occur at where? At the skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, liver. Because why in the liver? Because it's going to increase the glycogenolysis. So it means that during this time, during the sympathetic response, your body needs a lot of sugar. Okay, so this sugar going to be break to produce an energy and ATP. That's why it comes up with the glycogenolysis. So it means that produce of glucose from the process of glycogenolysis, means breakdown of the glycogen or store glucose lah by the liver, in the liver, right? As well as the breakdown of the adipose tissue that you have been stored under the process of the lipolysis to produce energy. Yeah, alright. Okay, I then mentioned this one just now. Alright, so now let's take a look at the cell body from the sympathetic nervous system. I did mention that the sympathetic nervous system, its pre-order neuron or the first order neuron are actually originates from the thoracic segment and also the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. Okay, so means that its preganglionic neuron, the cell body of the preganglionic neuron are actually originates from the thoracic and lumbar segment or thoracolumbar outflow of the spinal cord. So all of these informations either from T1 down to L2, it going to innervate or give informations to the next ganglion. Either that ganglion could be ganglion in the sympathetic, ganglion in the sympathetic, it could be in the sympathetic change, meaning that the change that stay really near to the spinal cord, or a second option, it go to the another ganglia other than the sympathetic chain, which is the collateral ganglia. Okay, so what are the collateral ganglia? They are ciliary ganglia, celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglia, inferior mesenteric ganglia. So these three ganglia, we call it as the collateral ganglia. Okay, or it can also, the ganglionic neuron can also go to another ganglia other than these two, which is the organ itself, which is the adrenal medulla. We call it as the intramural ganglia. Okay, so later, all of these informations, or when all of these first order neuron communicate with the second order neuron in the ganglia, all of these informations later will be further travel to its effector organ. Okay, to its target organ. So if you take a look at this one, the orange color coded means that this adrenal medulla or the intramural ganglia, they don't have a second order neuron in order to target the effector organ, but somehow they will straight away release the hormone or neurotransmitter. Okay, and then later into the blood circulations and pass to the whole of the body system. Okay, so come again to the examples you can see. So we have the sympathetic change here, the sympathetic change ganglia. You have a collateral ganglia. So this ganglia, we call it as the greater splenic nerve. We call it greater splenic nerve. Okay, from a greater splenic nerve. This one is collateral ganglia. And then we have a lesser splenic nerve. And down below here, you have the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Alright. Where the intramural? Oh, this one is the intramural ganglia. On top of the kidney, we have the adrenal medulla. Okay. But if you take a look at the parasympathetic later, they straight away go to other ganglia lah. So we forget about this first. Just focus on the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so what is the effect when this sympathetic sympathetic system has been activated? Okay. So now let's focus on the one that originate from T1 to T2. Okay, T1 to T2. So once this T1 and T2 has been activated, it will innervate to the regions to the ganglion in the superior cervical ganglion. So all of these informations will go straight away to the superior cervical ganglion. And from the superior cervical ganglion, it will innervate the organ which include the eye, the salivary gland, as well as the heart. The eye, the salivary gland, as well as the heart. So what does it do to the eye? It will dilate the pupil so that these persons under the stimulations of the sympathetic system, they will have a fear vision. Okay, fear pula, far vision. Okay, so dia memang tengah fear pun waktu tu. So far vision. So it will cause the dilations of the pupils, and it will contract the orbital disc and also the smooth muscles of the tarsals. And in the salivary gland, okay, it will cause a thick and viscous secretion. So means that during that time, during the nervous process, during the anxiety or stressful process, you no longer going to think that you're going to eat or digest food. Alright, during this time it's just for emergency response. So your salivary glands start to produce a thick and viscous secretion. But for the heart, in order to compensate the need of the oxygens and also the needs of the energy during that time, they're going to increase the heart rate as well as the contractility of the heart. So basically, in the dilations of the pupil, in a low light or in the sympathetic response, okay, so basically it start going to release the norepinephrine, and this norepinephrine going to undergo the constrictions or contractions of the iris muscles, and thus it will increase the pupil dilations. Macam ni boleh nampak dia besar. But in the positions of a high light, for example, okay, your parasympathetic going to be activated. Alright, what you will do, the pupils gonna go constriction. Alright. So basically for the low light or sympathetic response, okay, from here you can see that it will straight away go to the sympathetic nervous systems and to the pupils and cause the dilations of the pupils. But in the parasympathetic, the informations are actually originated in the adrenergic nucleus. Okay, now let's move on to the one that originated from T3 and T4. Okay, T3 and T4 region. So these T3 and T4 regions, the informations will be relayed in the middle cervical ganglia as well as the inferior cervical ganglia. Alright, from the middle cervical ganglia to the inferior cervical ganglia, it will innervate the heart rate, it will innervate the heart, and it cause the increase the heart rate, cardiac output as well as the blood pressure. Okay, in the esophagus, kat sini tak ada, it's not mentioned here, I think, yeah. In the esophagus, what it will do, as I mentioned, esophagus is actually part of the digestive system. So in the sympathetic activations, we don't want the sympathetic activations to be activated. Okay, that one belongs to rest and digest. So whatever it is in the esophagus, still that they will receive the sympathetic innervations, but during this time they will reduce the sympathetic activity by decreasing reduce its firing and cause decrease in the peristalsis. Meanwhile, for the lung, to compensate the needs of the oxygens to break down to produce an energy or whatnot, in the lungs, it will cause the relaxations of the bronchial smooth muscles, thus cause the dilations of the bronchial. So means that you have a bronchial which is like acting like a tube, okay, the air tube. So during the sympathetic activity, this air tube going to be dilated. Its smooth muscle going to be relaxed, and later it going to be dilated, so that easy to get air in and out, so it will ensure the effective gaseous exchange. Okay, so for T5 and T9, just random je lah T5 and T9, it will go to the greater splenic nerve, and later it will go to the celiac ganglion. So the ganglia that they relay from the T5 and T9 are basically outside of the sympathetic change ganglia, and its ganglia are actually located in the celiac ganglion. So from the celiac ganglion, all the information will innervate the liver, by which it will increase the glycogenolysis. In the pancreas, what it will do, it will decrease the biliary secretions, it will increase the glucagon and decrease the insulin, right? And then in the stomach, it will decrease the peristalsis, decrease the absorptions, decrease the secretions, and transverse colon will start to have inhibitory activity. Means they will not undergo the peristalsis process, right? And for the spleen, it will cause a splenic contraction. Continue again on the greater splenic nerve. Okay, it will go part of it. Okay, from T5 to T9, mana T5 to T9, it will straight away go from here dekat lesser splenic nerve ni. Okay, lesser splenic nerve. This one is the lesser splenic nerve. Part of it will go to the intramural from here. Okay, greater splenic nerve. Okay, it will go to the intramural ganglion, which is at the adrenal medulla. In the adrenal medulla, it will release the epinephrine or adrenaline into the bloodstream. Tak adalah kalau awak nampak kat sini dia macam straight je, dia lintas kat sini, it goes straight to the adrenal medulla. There no second order neuron on it. And from the T6 to T12, when it goes to the lesser splenic nerve, mana ya, sini, lesser splenic nerve, okay, it will go to the prevertebral ganglia and go to the effective organ. For example, like this one, we have the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. It will decrease the peristalsis, by which it will go to the ascending colon, transverse colon, as well as the small intestine. Okay, sini nampak ascending colon, transverse colon, and small intestine. But the descending colon, it will be under the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Don't get yourself confused. Okay, so renal plexus in the kidney, they will decrease the urine production, decrease renal blood flow, and release renin. Right? For the portions of lumbar region, which is L1 up to L3, L1, L2, L3 macam tu lah. Okay, it will go to the lumbar splenic nerve, inferior mesenteric ganglia. What it will do, it will go to the bladder, and in the bladder, it will cause relaxations of the detrusor muscle. So when it relax, you tak rasa lah nak kecing kan, relaxations of the detrusor muscles, uterus, fallopian tube, testis, prostate, seminal vesicle, vas deferens, and whatnot. Okay. So basically, in our sympathetic nervous systems, in controls of the autonomic nervous system, you are actually less likely to be aware in the functions of the autonomic nervous system at all time. Okay, kita busy, you are very busy, and you not notice whatever being unconsciously being controlled by your body system. But then, until at one point when this system are actually being ruined or undergo haywire or undergo disturbance, then only you will notice the importance of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so basically you use it in the emergency response. You not notice it during the daily routine. So here is examples of the disturbance in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So one of the example is the otostatic hypotension. So basically, when you sit down or lying down, your blood is actually pulled at the bottom regions of your body. When you standing up, all of this blood going to be down or being pulled up by the gravity. So in order to make sure that your brain going to be receive enough blood supply, your calf muscles start to contract to deliver all of the blood that being pulled down by the gravity towards the superior regions of your superior part of your body. But somehow, also who detect this reflex is actually the autonomic control. But sometimes some of the people, they might have haywire in their autonomic nervous system. The system cannot detect the fall in the blood pressure. So you will start feeling dizzy. So when you start feeling dizzy, that called as the autostatic hypotension. Okay, for example, like fall in the systolic pressure more than 20 mm of mercury or diastolic pressure more than 10 mm of mercury within a minute, we classify it as the autostatic hypotension. This is occur in a certain person, but in a normal healthy persons like all of you right now, when you sit down and you standing up, your calf muscle are actually start contracting to give a supply to your whole of the body system, because your heart start detecting that there is low blood pressure at the upper body regions. So the autonomic nervous system going to contract and pass all of the blood. Okay. So from here, we're going to take a look at the sympathetic system neurotransmitter. Okay. In the neurotransmitter, in the somatic efferent, never mind, because I did mention to you just now that in the somatic efferent, somatic nervous system, they will only release acetylcholine, and the muscles that acting on the acetylcholine, the receptors that acting on the acetylcholine is the nicotinic receptors. But for sympathetic, just focus on the sympathetic first. On the sympathetic nervous system, they will release acetylcholine at the and the receptors that will receive the acetylcholine is the nicotinic receptors. But for the second order neuron, some of it going to release norepinephrine, okay, And the receptors that are going to receive this norepinephrine called as the adrenergic receptors. But we, other than nicotinic receptors that we receive acetylcholine, we have another type of receptor which is known as the muscarinic receptors. Okay. So for example, that blood vessels, sweat gland. So blood vessel and sweat gland, they has the muscarinic receptors. Okay. So now let's take a look at the neurotransmitter as well as the receptors. Okay, sini lah, sini. This is the neurotransmitter, and on top of the cell bodies, here there is a receptor for that responsible neurotransmitters. Okay, so now let's move on to the neuron first, right? So neuron first, the neurons that release acetylcholine, we call it as the cholinergic neuron. So which neuron are releasing acetylcholine? This one release acetylcholine, this one as well, this one releasing acetylcholine, this one also release acetylcholine. So this one and this one as well. So all of these neurons, we call it as the cholinergic neuron. Okay, so a neurons that release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, we call it as the cholinergic neuron. So who are the cholinergic neuron? All the sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic, betul ke? All sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic, yes, they are all cholinergic neuron. Okay, and then sympathetic postganglionic that innervate sweat gland and blood vessels. Okay, innervate the sweat gland and blood vessels. Okay, the one that innervate the sweat gland and blood vessels. Okay, and also the skeletal muscles, this one lah. So this is known as the cholinergic neurons. And all parasympathetic postganglionic neuron, all sympathetic postganglionic neuron ni, are also the cholinergic neurons. Okay, sorry. So all of these cholinergic neuron, they will release acetylcholine. Okay. So where does this acetylcholine going to act? So acetylcholine are actually like a key that going to act on a door. Okay, so the door for the acetylcholines could be nicotinic or muscarinic. So means that the place that this acetylcholine can bind to, the receptors that this acetylcholine can bind to, is actually nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. So where does this nicotinic receptors located? It is located in the sympathetic postganglionic. Is it correct? Sympathetic postganglionic. Okay, yeah. Okay. And then they have a parasympathetic postganglionic. Is it? Parasympathetic postganglionic nicotinic here. Okay. Alright. And then they have motor and plate of neuromuscular junction. Motor and plates of the neuromuscular junction. So all of these are nicotinic. So we call it as the nicotinic receptors. And another one, we have a muscarinic receptor. So where does this muscarinic receptor located? Here. Muscarinic receptors is located in the small muscle cardiac muscles gland, and innervates by parasympathetic postganglionic axon. And the effect for the cholinergic neuron nicotinic receptors, it can cause depolarization and excitation. For muscarinic receptor, it can cause depolarization, excitations, or inhibitions. It's depending on which part of muscarinic receptor site that being activated. Okay, for muscarinic receptors, bear in mind it could be excitations or inhibition, but for nicotinic receptor, basically it causes excitation. Alright, so now let's move on to the adrenergic neurons. So what is adrenergic neuron? Tadi kita kata neurons that release the acetylcholine, we call it as the cholinergic neuron. So adrenergic neuron means that the neuron that release adrenaline. So this one release adrenaline, not adrenaline. So this is adrenergic neuron. Okay. So where does this adrenergic neuron located? It located mostly on the sympathetic postganglionic. Alright. And it could either release a neurotransmitter or a hormone, for example, like adrenal medulla. Alright. So what is the receptors for this adrenergic neuron? Or adrenal medulla, or epinephrine or non-epinephrine? It could be alpha or beta. alpha receptors or beta receptors. So what it can cause both either excitations or inhibition. Alright. Okay, so that's its part of the autonomic nervous system, focusing on the autonomic nervous system. So that is part of the autonomic nervous system, focusing on the parasympathetic. Okay, so that is part of the autonomic nervous system, focusing on the sympathetic nervous system. Right. So now let's move on to the parasympathetic nervous system. Alright, so in parasympathetic nervous system, alright, I did mention to you just now that the neurons of the first order neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system originated from the cranial segment as well as the sacral segment. So we call it as the cranial sacral division or cranial sacral outflow. Okay. Here is the cranial segment of the spinal cord, which includes the cranial nerve number 3, number 7, number 9, and number 10. And then as well as we have the cranial, the sacral regions, which includes the S2 to S4 segments of the spinal cord. Alright. So please bear in mind with this Roman numbering. So the cranial nerve, the ganglion for the parasympathetic nervous system includes ciliary ganglion, pterygopalatine, submandibular ganglia, otic ganglia, intramural ganglia, means that the ganglion is actually located in the organ itself, okay, as well as in the pelvic nerve. Basically, from the sacral portions, it is in the intramural ganglia. So in the ciliary ganglia, it will innervate its target organ at the eye region. For the pterygopalatine or submandibular, looking at its name, you will know that where does it will innervate. So it will innervate the nasal gland, tear glands, and salivary gland. For otic ganglia, it's on parotid salivary glands, intramural, and so forth lah. Okay, so now let's take a look at the parasympathetic nuclei. So basically, it's parasympathetic nuclei located at the Adrenergic nucleus, and from the Adrenergic nucleus, it will come out as the cranial nerve number 3, and this cranial nerve number 3, it will relay it will synapse with the second or post-order neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system in the ciliary ganglion and go to the target organ. And basically, this nerve we call it as the oculomotor nerve, right? And then for the second one, coming from the lacrimal nucleus, superior salivary nucleus, it's from a cranial nerve number 7, and this cranial nerve number 7 is also called as the facial nerve, and it will go to the pterygopalatine ganglion and submandibular ganglion and go to the most of it as the lacrimal and nasal gland, submandibular gland, and so forth. Okay, and then down to the cranial nerve number 9, it will go to the otic ganglion, or this cranial nerve called as the glossopharyngeal nerve. And last but not least, the one that coming from the dorsal motor nucleus or vagal nerve, in the cranial nerve number 10, it will form the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve will innervate directly to the target organ. Okay. Okay, so from the vagus nerve, tadi saya cakap kan, you have a lot of nerve. You have oculomotor nerve, facial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, and this one is the vagus nerve. Okay, and also the pelvic splenic nerve. So from all of these nerve, vagus nerve are actually contributing 75% of the parasympathetic system. Okay, so this vagus nerve contributes 75% of the parasympathetic outflow. Okay, so from here, we will have a look at the cardiac plexus, celiac plexus, inferior mesenteric plexus, and whatnot lah. Okay, never mind. So what is the functions of the parasympathetic function? So I did mention you so many times. The function is for rest and digest, for restore the body energy, for the reserve of the sympathetic activity later on. Okay, And then what it will do, it will stimulate the intestinal motility, secretion, digestion, and as well as absorption. And it will also promote the reproductive function. That's why you cannot stress. Nanti tak boleh reproduce. Sudah. Okay. So in the parasympathetic response, this situation basically we call it as a SLUT, which is a salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. So what they will do, they will decrease in heart rate, diameter in the airways, and diameter of the pupils. Okay, so now let's focus on the first one that coming out from the endogenous nucleus. So from the endogenous nucleus, it will go to the cranial nerve number 3 or oculomotor nerve. It will go to the ciliary ganglion. What it will do, it will constrict the pupils, constrict the ciliary muscles, and it will focus on the near vision. Okay, so you can read by yourself lah for this one. This is just for you to just notes, additional notes for you. Okay, so now let's take a look at the superior salivary nucleus. Superior salivary nucleus, this one. Okay, this portion. So it will come out as the cranial nerve number 7. Okay, and it will go to the pterygopalatine ganglion, and it will causes activations of the lacrimal gland, and it will cause enhance in the secretion. Okay, when it goes to the inferior, when it comes from the inferior salivary nuclei, some of it nanti akan jadi cranial nerve number 7. It will go to the submandibular ganglion, and in the submandibular sini dekat sini sebenarnya superior ni, submandibular ganglion, it will causes profuse watery secretion. Okay, because we know that parasympathetic adalah rest and digest. Nak digest macam mana? Produce salivation lah. That's why they produce profuse watery secretion. Okay, this is a facial nerve. Tadi I did mention. In the inferior salivary nuclei, coming from the cranial nerve number 9, okay, it will go to the otic ganglion. What it will do, it will facilitate the salivary secretion, blood gaseous or curative bodies, okay, chemosensory information, and also baroreceptor informations to control the blood pressure at the carotid sinus. Okay, sini dia pergi dekat heart ni, dia akan reduce blood pressure semualah, and in opposite of the sympathetic activity. Okay, when it goes to the heart, to the lungs, to the intrinsic plexus and kidney, what it will do the things that opposite to the one that occur in the sympathetic activities. Okay, for example, let's take a look at the heart. We do know that the heart is actually had received dual innervations from both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, when you look at the right vagus nerve, so the right side of the vagus nerve, it will go to the SA nodes. And the left vagus nerve, it will go to the AV node. So these nerve or innervations are actually controlling a different port or different portion. Macam dia pergi USB port lain-lain lah. So the right side go to the SA, the left side go to the AV node. In the lungs, it will cause constrictions of the bronchioles, right? And in the intrinsic plexus of the GI tract, it will increase the motility. Okay, now let's focus to the sacral region. Okay, so its ganglia basically located in the effector organ itself. Okay, by which its ganglia innervate the structures inside the pelvic itself. For example, we have the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, internal anus sphincter, urinary bladder, and reproductive organ. What it will do, it will enhance its process. Okay. Focusing on the neurotransmitter as well as the receptors. So parasympathetic fibers are known as the cholinergic fibers. So why cholinergic? Because they release acetylcholine. So pre and post going to release acetylcholine. So they are cholinergic neurons, right? So the receptors are basically cholinergic muscarinic or cholinergic nicotinic, depending on the target organ. Okay. Here is the examples of the cholinergic muscarinic receptors. For example, in the heart, smooth muscle and the glands, and the nicotinic receptors in the neuromuscular junction. This one general neuromuscular junction ni sebenarnya dekat skeletal muscles pun adalah benda yang sama nicotinic receptors. Okay. Okay, this one is just a characteristics of the neurotransmitter. I think you can read this by yourself later on about the norepinephrine, acetylcholine. So what is the character and what they did? Okay, so basically the effect of the sympathetic stimulations last longer comparing to the parasympathetic activity. So why does the sympathetic activity last longer? The first one, because the sympathetic postganglionic axon diverges more extensively. So means that the outlet is extensive comparing to the parasympathetic. Okay, and they can innervate many tissues simultaneously, right? And another option is they have the acetylcholine esterase, by which acetylcholine esterase basically they're going to inactivate the acetylcholine, alright? Whereas this norepinephrine later going to take longer time in the synaptic life. Okay. Okay. So this is just a recap on the autonomic tone, on the homeostatic imbalance or autostatic hypotension. Okay, sometimes this rarely happen in a younger person. Basically, it happen in elderly because there might be something wrong with the autonomic nervous system first, or any other conditions that causes the imbalance in their autonomic control. Okay, in normal condition, for example, like when you're sitting down, so the blood is actually circulating all of your body system, okay, at a certain time. Maksudnya masa awak duduk tu evenly lah, it will go to the whole of the body system. But when you stand up, due to the gravity, it will pull, due to the presence of the gravity, it will pull all the blood down to the lower part of your body lah. But somehow during this time, your upper region or upper portions of your body start detecting that there is lack of blood pressure at the superior portions of your body. Then your calf muscles start contracting, your blood vessels start to contracting, so that it will push back all the blood into the head region, okay, like this supposedly. Therefore, when it passes the blood, okay, the blood will be dilated, increase the heart rate and whatnot. Then this increment in the heart rate can alter the changes, the physiological changes in the body system, and later undergo the homeostasis process to the normal. So other than that, we have two reasons of the autostatic hypotension. The first one may be due to the hypovolemic, or second one autonomic failure. So hypovolemic, what does that mean? That means that when your body lack of a certain volume inside your body, for example like your blood lah, for example, so in the dehydration ke kan, medication effects or diuretic ke apa ke, so it will cause reduce in the volume, thus causes the hypo or reduce the blood pressure lah. Jadi hypotension lah. Okay. So in autonomic failure, it could be to the damage in the peripheral system, for example like diabetes, complicated with diabetes lah basically. Alright, so it will causes multiple system atrophy. Okay, autonomic. Okay, so in the autonomic dysfunctions, we have a lesion that can cause to the autonomic nervous system either due to a disease or an injury. So we have a primary autonomic failure, means that it's occur to the autonomic nervous system itself, or a secondary failure means that it's certain disease that cause failure in the autonomic nervous system. Okay, here is the examples of a certain disease that affect the sympathetic system. First one, we have the Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome, this one lah, means that basically both of our eyes will acting synchronously. So means that if let's say you shine a light on the right eye, and you cover the left eye, the right eye only will be shine with the light. You covered the left eye, and then when you open, the size of the pupil should be normal, should be equal. Though it does not receive the light from the similar sources as what the right eye receive, but somehow it will still change similarly to the other eye. But in Horner syndrome, as you can see that the other eye cannot respond normal. In the Ronald phenomenon, for example, In neuronal disease, basically this person will have bluish portions of their peripheral regions, macam fingers ke apa ke. They don't feel that because their receptors does not send the lack of the circulations at the peripheral regions. As well as in the buccal disease. Okay, here is the example as the tonic purple. Okay. Another example that we have is the Frey syndrome. Okay, those who have gone through the surgery, for example, some of it might have a Frey syndrome because their autonomic nervous system undergo dysfunction or disturbance. Here is the Hirschsprung disease. Okay, alright. I'm not going to discuss about this what do we call the disturbances so many because we're going to discuss this in STD. I think that's all for me today in the chapter of the autonomic nervous system, which includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic. If let's say you have a certain questions or you don't understand any part of this umbrella, please feel free to ask me. And I think that's all from me today. Thank you very much for your attention and attendance. See you again next time.